All right. Let's just get things settled here. What's up, one and all? Kilo about 10 Gun here, hanging out on this Monday evening. I've been playing with some new content and material, and one of the things I've been considering has been launching this whole concept of investigations. And figured that I started off with a conversation last week, and I'm going to commit to one night a week going into this whole concept of these intuitive investigations, which I have and actually am continuing to do, and just kind of talking about recounting stories or telling you about things that I'm working on at present around, I don't know, somewhere between Doctor Strange and Sherlock Holmes is where I walk. And this one particular case that I'm recounting occurred in the area of Kahakapau in the town of Makawao. And last week I talked a bit about hiking off trail, encountering some interesting tracks that, as on that first day, I had wandered into this area, really just following my own intuition. And as I did, led me effectively to this area which I felt compelled to center and to meditate at. And so there I was meditating at this tree, this big, beautiful tree. And I opened my eyes in this somewhat altered state of consciousness after having gone into a very deep, powerful, and profound meditation. And as I open my eyes, I see that in front of me, there is this large displacement of leaves, which looked like a footprint. And so I was like, oh, kind of just laughing to myself, oh, what if? And I proceed to find another and another and another, which inevitably led me to realize that I had stumbled upon tracks. And as I look at this, thinking to myself, what the heck can leave a track like this? A trail of feet that were nearly twice as big as mine, with a stride length that required me to take the longest possible step just to make one foot meet the other. Well, that's what brings us into this evening's retelling and the recounting of this. The experience of finding some mysterious prints here on the island of Maui. Way off trail in the area of Makawao, what some call the Makawao Forest Reserve. And so because there is such curiosity, this was not my first encounter of something mysterious. This was 2019. And at this point, had been doing this sort of work for about the last 4 years or so. And so this really led into some interesting territory, because a lot of what I had experienced up until this point were more disincarnate spirits, ghosts, possessions, things of this nature. However, I didn't quite know what this was, and I also wanted to make sure that rather than making an assumption, that I carried out my investigation as I do. And so, as I said, intuitive investigation. And so it's one part intuition, another part intelligence. I gather information, both metaphysically and physically, and utilize this whole process to better determine and to discern what may or may not be happening. So with this case, it takes us into the wilderness of Makawao, where unexplained tracks existed, relatively fresh, that almost magically as it was, mysteriously appeared out of nowhere and seemingly did the same in terms of where it then abruptly ended. And so after finding this, my head was still spinning. At the end of last week, we finished off with me departing and leaving that area, which I did. Still really very confused in terms of what I had just seen. I had taken a bunch of pictures. I will post that online and link it to all this as well. And so really, what was I dealing with? Was this a matter of another person just creating this, which as I went through the whole process, again, I was pretty off trail. And it's not to say that others would not be there. However, it was just a little odd because as I looked back at my own tracks and compared it to those that I was seeing in front of me, there was a vast difference. Again, this was in and under a whole canopy of eucalyptus trees. And eucalyptus, if you've ever seen it, as the leaves drop, it creates a whole almost carpet of leaves, let alone the actual bark that shreds and falls off the trees themselves. And so as such, the floor of the forests where it was completely covered. And as I looked back upon my own tracks, walking and hiking to get there, I could see like the subtle imprint of my own body weight upon my own footprint upon the leaves and the bark of the trees. And so as I compared that against what I was seeing, which was effectively seemingly about, a 30-inch displacement in a footprint, let alone the fact that it alternated and that the displacement matched what I would expect a foot to do as well, right? Sort of like a triangular shape, not a perfect triangle. It sloped up and then went down and so on and so forth. And so there was a whole thing about it in terms of, well, if someone were to actually create something like this, leaving neither trail to the actual point of displacement, let alone the displacement itself. When I was walking on the leaves, it compressed slightly, and I could see the very subtle markings of just a slight imprint. What I was looking at was the whole area was actually clear of the actual leaves themselves, and I could see the dirt beneath the leaves. So there was a real displacement of, except for the couple of leaves. Again, this was probably, 1 to 2 days after the fact, whenever it was created, by whomever it was created by. And as such, there were a couple of leaves here and there in the actual print itself. So I leave that day with more questions than I did have answers, determined to come back the next day and to bring along both my intuitive and intelligent tools. Now, what that means is that with my intuitive tools, it's everything from bringing pendulum to dowsing rods to ceremonial pieces. At the time, I had a certain process to open up communication with other types of beings. In addition to that would be an EMF reader, bringing in, digital audio recorders, looking at things in terms of a position, a camera that I could position, and then going through that whole process. So that evening, scouring the internet, well, what else could that be? Are there stories, as we say in Hawaii, are there mo'olelo of giants here on Maui, which there were not. There were on Oahu and then on the island of Kauai. Are there stories of beings in these forests, which at the time I wasn't able to find anything that would even suggest? Messaged a bunch of friends in terms of having any kind of awareness of spiritual entities that may exist and dwell in the mountains of Maui. That didn't turn up anything at all as well, which led me then kind of crossing that off of the list, things that are more native to these lands. Well, what about my first inclination? my instincts that were screaming a Bigfoot. And so I started to go down that rabbit hole. And so I was looking at all of these different things, resolved again to come back the next day and to actually conduct an investigation. Next day comes along and I'm loaded up with all of my stuff, this time learning from the previous day's experience on wearing pants and high boots because that area scratched my legs up pretty darn good. And so as I went through that whole process, then I decided that I would go back to the area that I had initially found these tracks at. And in doing so, go back into what I would call my trance state and see if there was something that I could detect. And in doing so, brought all the tools that I would need. And at the time, I would smoke tobacco, and that would help to open my field up and allow me to interact then with other beings. So I go back to this area, the tree that I had initially been drawn towards. I sit there cross-legged, just looking at the trail, close my eyes, go into my breathing pattern, lower my energy, my heart rate, my breath, in terms of just allowing my body to drop into a more restful, not just state, also a higher state of coherence. And all that means is that my body and my mind came into this place of connectivity. And in doing so, then I opened up my eyes. I began to smoke, I mean, full on like Gandalf wizard pipe, right? And so I began to smoke that in the wilderness. And then I would do this thing in terms of gazing. And if you can kind of think of almost slightly, like it's like a relaxed gaze. If you think back to those pictures, right? Where you'd have all of these shards of colors, and then you kind of look at it and it has like a 3D effect. So something along those lines is what I would use to perceive entities, beings, and spirits. And so had my wizard pipe full of tobacco, and then I closed my eyes again, set the intention, and then I stayed in that way for a while, just allowing the sensory experience to really open up. And then as I opened up my eyes, I just began to gaze. I began to look. And not unsurprisingly, I didn't see anything. Again, the tracks were 1 to 2 days old by the time I found it the day prior to. So I would close my eyes again. And I expanded an extra sensory faculty. And so allowing my senses to open up. My gaze with my physical eyes then went into a beholding with my third eye. And then as I began to open up, I could sense the residual energy of a frequency that I just wasn't familiar with. It was like when you look at a light bulb, and as you look at a light bulb and then you just close your eyes or you avert your eyes someplace else, and there is the residual image of that light that's still held within your vision. So something along those lines. And so I could sense something, 2 areas where there was a sense of something. And so I thought, oh, well, that's rather curious. And so as I attempted to, for myself, one thing that I'm capable of doing is tracking energy. So if I have a sense, like a residual, that could be like a residual frequency or energy, and if I put my attention upon it, I can kind of follow where it goes, wherever it originates from, and or where it currently dwells at. And so I tracked the energy, attempting to find it, and allowed my senses to go with, which eventually hit a wall. So I began to track it. It seemingly was in front of me, just on the other way, about 20 feet in front was that residual sense, which was also around where the footprints had ceased abruptly. And so I began to track it, which left Maui entirely. However, it hit a wall and then I lost it. I wasn't able to go past that almost barrier. And so that turned up to be a dead end. And so I came out of that. And sitting there, one of the things that I use is and are different cards. My intuitive talent type is an energetic kinesthetic. And so I utilize the innate intelligence of my body to support in this whole intuitive process. And so I brought out some tarot cards and I laid it out in terms of a question. And the answer basically suggested that there was more to this place and it was in my best interest to continue on. And so I have had in my earlier experiences some very strict teaching in terms of intuition and how there can be some interference from other things. And so I go through a whole process of what I call discernment. And so I had that in terms of my pure trance state experience, translated it then and added layer with the tarot cards, and then went one more with muscle testing. And so I muscle tested, is it in my highest best interest to ... And in this case, it was to further my investigation, to leave this area and to continue on following my senses, which it said yes. So I ended up setting up a digital audio recorder, leaving it there, set up a camera, had it there, had that to basically be there for the entire time that I was gone. And then I just went off on to further off trail. And so I used my pendulum to give me a direction on where to go and just sort of followed my own instincts. So I start to go even further now off trail, heading up the mountain, further deeper into the woods. And so I'd love to say that as I continued on, that I found more prints, which I was looking for, or some kind of evidence that may exist. And ultimately on that day, it was not a fruitful experience in those regards. So I continued on for a couple of hours. Ultimately, I knew that I was near something. I just didn't know what. And so after a couple of hours wandering, I decided to go head back to collect my equipment and then to process that back home. And so I picked up my recorder and the camera and processed all of that, and nothing was really there. And, you know, with investigation, sometimes there are, sometimes there's not. Some things that we can find, that I've found, is with cameras, there can be disruption that exists. On one case in San Francisco, the security cameras of the hotel I was investigating it's completely wavy. It's whatever, 11 o'clock at night, completely wavy. All of a sudden it's displaced. The camera stops working for a bit and then comes back on. With the audio pieces, sometimes there can be little noises of movement or the sound of something that's there, often inaudible. That day, though, not a whole lot of, and a whole lot of nada. And so I collected all my things and went back home, and still incredibly intrigued, ever curious, very much lost in this space of wonder. I started to dig even deeper. So with more, I would say, so I went both the indigenous route in terms of stories and mythology with indigenous peoples, in terms of the concepts of the Bigfoot or Sasquatch as an elder, as an ancestor, as a sibling, going into more of the contemporary pieces, more, I would say, metaphysical concepts around it. And that went into like interdimensional beings, that everything from hollow earth to allies of humanity in different solar systems. I mean, there was a lot that I had no idea even existed about any of this. And so as I went through that, I was really curious, because the part that really stuck out was the appearance of the prints and the disappearance abruptly, like they just all of a sudden stopped, of the prints. And so this brought up a lot of curiosity. And then as I began to find a little bit more out about some of the stories of people who have had these types of experiences, it really went a lot deeper into this concept of these interdimensional travelers, which then to a certain degree would explain how these beings can appear and then suddenly disappear. So day 3. Now this is first day finding the tracks, second day going back to those said tracks, third day now wanting to find out what else is there. Are there more tracks? Are there beings currently who live in this area that dwell here? Is it a place that these things are just kind of passing through? Like what is all of this? Maybe, or is it just none of that? And so day 3, I head back out, and I had done another reading the day of, and there's something there. I meant to find it and to be able to just tune into nature. So I didn't really know what exactly that meant. So as I arrive there, I do a greeting chant, which I had done pretty continuously at this trail. Any new trail that I head off onto, I'll typically offer a chant, sort of an acknowledgement of the land or the aina that I'm on, and an introduction of myself, who I am, and what I'm about. And so I did my closed eye chant, and then I opened my eyes, and the first thing that I saw was a passion fruit or a lilikoi vine. Now, when I close my eyes and go very internal, when I open it, inevitably, especially if I'm holding an intention and something just kind of pops out at me, that's something for me to follow. And so I was like, okay, lilikoi. I want to follow the lilikoi. I don't know what that means. However, that's going to be my ally on this day. And so sure enough, I backtracked to the tracks, and now even more leaves have begun to fill the tracks. Again, that was almost completely displaced, exposing the dirt that existed beneath the eucalyptus leaves and the bark itself. And so as I start there, I again begin to head off trail. And this time I went in a different direction than I did the previous day. And so I'm heading further uphill. And as I'm looking, I'm just allowing myself to be led. And at the same time, keeping both eyes open for this lilikoi. A little bit of pendulum work, my highest and best interest. Where is it that I meant to go? And then the pendulum would begin. I usually have it swinging in a clockwise circle, and then it'll start to swing in a certain area. And then once it begins to swing, then I'll follow that direction. Following my intuition, allowing my instincts to lead, sort of a mix between the two. And when I say a mix between the two, one is a higher sensory faculty. That is our intuition, our capacity to access fields of information that exist, which is a little different than our instinct, which is the processing capacity of our subconscious mind and being able to access that level of physical sensory experience in our conscious mind. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And so I started to see then, as I'm again way off trail, I started to see then these patches of lilikoi. And if you're familiar with how lilikoi or passion fruit grows, it's on a vine, and often it will sprawl on and over things. It needs something to climb effectively. And so as I was following these little patches here and there, I started maybe about 45 minutes after leaving that area with the prints, I started to feel like a little bit of a headache. Now, I don't often get headaches. I was feeling it though. I started to feel the headache. I started to feel a little nauseated, and I was like, oh, was it something that I ate? Was it something that I had drank? And I was like, I haven't really had a whole lot today. And what I had eaten and drank on that day wasn't anything out of the ordinary. However, I'm be stubborn and I can dig in on points. And so instead of stopping, I just kind of continued on, following the pendulum, watching for other patches of lilikoi. And so it goes about 20 minutes and I haven't seen anything, but I'm still dealing with this sense of just pain in my head and nausea in my stomach. And so as I continue to go, all of a sudden it just kind of stops. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of weird. And as I look up, I see these 2 trees, like massive trees, at least for this forest. Maybe, I don't know, like 5 feet across. So, fairly large trees. And so I see these 2 trees, both of which have lilikoi, and passion fruit climbing and spiraling around its trunk. And then all of a sudden, boom, there is just this deep sense of knowing, this certainty that this is what I'm looking for. I don't know what the fuck this is, mind you, yet I know that this is what I've been looking for. And so in occultism, when we start to look at Jewish mysticism in particular, we start to talk about the tree of life, for example. There are these columns that exist, and they are important because they are almost a gateway. They're the structure to the roadmap of our soul. And so that instantly flashes into my mind's eye. And I instantaneously know that I'm meant to go right into the middle and to go into my altered state of consciousness. And so here I am again, way, like I was off trail before where I found the prints. Now I'm way off trail out in the wilderness of Kahakapau, very far from any living being, well, any other human beings, at least. And so I go right into the middle of these two trees, which are columns, the gateways to who knows what. Bust out my wizard pipe, toss in some tobacco, light it, smoke, allow my field to open, close my eyes, and I just allow myself sitting cross-legged on the ground to enter into a state of trance. And when I say trance, that is me dropping into a lower brainwave frequency to enter into an altered state of consciousness to allow my intuition and extrasensory organs to open up. And so often that's the sensation, for me at least, of feeling high, and to bring my conscious mind down into the range of my subconscious, or in this case, superconscious mind. Now, the distinction between all that is conscious mind is that whopping 5 to 10%, right, that we like to revel in terms of our intelligence. The subconscious mind is that remainder 90 to 95% that constitutes the true depth and breadth of our emotions, life's experiences, so on and so forth. The superconscious mind is just awareness. It's presence. It's all of those things that exist, the connection that we all have in this broader, bigger, beautiful sense of oneness. And so I drop into that state, and I don't know if you've ever done a psychedelic. However, this had that feel. Fractal images, kaleidoscope of color and senses, deep knowing of things, and in this case, connection and communication with beings. And so I don't know how long I was there. Kind of lost track of time. However, what ended up happening was, I was seeing nebulas and galaxies. I was speaking with entities that I had no real context for. And mind you, at this point in time, I was very deep in my occultism. So things coming in from the occult sciences, looking at things within concepts around shamanism, looking at things in terms of like esoteric studies. And they didn't really talk a whole lot about neither concepts around the Sasquatch, well, some did, let alone beings from another galaxy. Yet effectively, that was my experience. And so the communication coming in terms of, yes, I was actually standing at an interdimensional gateway, kind of a bounce point for beings to be able to go to different places. And this was one of them. The knowing of the beings that I was speaking with being from the Andromeda galaxy. These beings, presumably, at least, what they were communicating as being more beneficial to humanity, and effectively their emissaries being these beings that I identified as a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. And so again, I'm not quite sure how long I was there. At some point I passed out. I wake up, I'm laying on the ground, looking up at these two trees towering over me and just feeling this buzzing. And so I slowly get myself up, still feeling pretty drunk from the whole experience. Slowly gather my things because I'm still, when I get into that state, I kind of stumble all over the place. And I'm not really fully grounded in my body. And so often what happens is I'm like clumsy as shit. As I'm getting up and kind of like wobbling, gathering my stuff, and I pack up my bag and begin to slowly walk now. And I can kind of see a clearing. And so I walk on towards this clearing. And it's funny because at the time I thought I was way off trail, and I walk onto a mountain bike trail, like not even that far away. You wouldn't be able to see where I was laid out and sprawled out on the ground. However, it was not nearly as far off trail as I had imagined. And so I was like, oh, this is probably a good thing to remember because this is a lot easier to find my way back here from here on out. And so I stumble onto this trail and I follow it all the way back down. And taking all that information now, having a little bit more, which at that time I really didn't have, again, much context for any of it. I didn't know what the fuck was happening. And so I take all that information, and as I had been doing, I did a short video journal, and then I also wrote some things out just to keep it all fresh in my head and mind, and took a little moment to eat and to drink, to ground back into my body. When I do this kind of work and my spiritual body and my physical body and all that, it's just out of sync, then usually if I have some dark chocolate, it just helps to realign and connect. And so I had my dark chocolate, and then I drove off. And so that intuitive aspect that came into play was really very interesting, because as I got back home with all those things relatively fresh, I started to do a little bit more research on specifically things around these beings, this Bigfoot figure, and came to find out that one of the experiences that some people have had is that there's almost this infrasound noise or signal that goes off. And for some people, it can be an experience of a headache. Others, it can be that sense of nausea, yet it is a frequency that is inaudible as it is palpable. Like I felt that. And it sucked. Like leaving that area, which was interesting. When I got out towards and I started to leave that area, I didn't really have that same experience. It was just approaching it. And so one of the things that I had read then is that for some people, when they encounter these beings, it's almost a way to dissuade people and their approach. It's a way that almost a protective mechanism that keeps certain persons at bay. And so it was interesting to see, because again, I hadn't known that prior to going there. However, I definitely experienced it. And so now things are really getting very interesting, because what's up with the Andromeda galaxy? Why are beings sending emissaries through these Bigfoot type creatures to Earth? What is the purpose? And so all these questions really began to come up, which is where then diving into some of the content material that is out there. And again, looking on both sides in terms of more of what the Western world has identified amongst these beings, and then also looking at some of the stories in terms of mythology that exists within indigenous practices as well. I mean, it really starts to get interesting because this wild man archetype is a very interesting one, because we're not just looking at the Bigfoot and the Sasquatch. We actually start to look at these different figures. Hanuman, for example, in like Hindu mythology and practices, or looking at other types of large, hairy, man-sized and shaped beings, and their part and piece in terms of different peoples is a reoccurring theme. And so I started to expand it beyond just what I had in terms of my own mind, or at least what made sense to me along the lines of the Bigfoot, and started to expand it even further, and started to see a thread, a consistency that existed as this type of being, largely, for the most part at least, more benevolent than it was malevolent in terms of its practices. So more a being of good to support in, rather than one to take advantage of and to destroy. And so a little more started to come to the surface. Yet so many more questions again than answers. And why was I able to find it? I mean, again, I wasn't that far away from this mountain bike trail. And sure enough, people mountain biking down this trail are not going to pause at the random 2 trees with the lily koi growing all over it. However, what came of that was more interest and intrigue, and would lead me not just to question the very nature of my reality up until that point, also to dive deeper in terms of a battle that has existed for eons and was tied directly to this gate and passage. Which, if you want to hear more, you have to tune in next week. For now, though, that is it. Love and aloha. Take care, and ahui ho.